Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. We bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
In our continuing coverage here this summer of the progress of the waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey, we have another guest joining us today. He's been on with us before and provided us some very valuable updates on what had been happening over the past few years with the survey. And so today's guest on the show is a good friend of mine, Dr. Ken Richkus, Chief of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Division of Migratory Bird Management. Ken, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Mike. It's always a pleasure to be here and chat about this important, long-standing waterfowl survey.
Yeah, it's 65 years, or well, it was 65 years as of 2 years ago whenever we had to take the pandemic-induced hiatus, but, 67 years now from, I guess, the first year it was officially conducted. Is my memory correct there?
You are correct.
And so we have, in fact, resumed the survey this year. I think people will probably know by now that have been paying attention that pilots are, in fact, in the air. Observers are counting ducks and counting ponds. We're recording this here on June 8th, and so the survey is well underway. A few weeks ago, we actually spoke with Fred Rutger from Fort Chippewa, and of course, Ken, you know Fred very well, former Fish and Wildlife Service survey pilot biologist, and he gave us an update on some of their work, and so yeah, it's happening. It's super exciting. I do want to give you an opportunity here at the outset to talk about any of the difficulty, the preparatory work that y'all had to do to actually make this happen, get this back going this year.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And I am happy to report and confirm that all the rumors are indeed true, that the May survey this year is being conducted in its entirety, which would be the first time in 2 years, kind of due to a break or major modifications due to COVID. But I will say that restarting the survey this year was not without its challenges. I know it's been a pretty significant lift in our part, and we started working pretty closely with the Canadian Wildlife Service early in 2022 to really start the coordination of this year's survey. And just for folks that might not know, the survey starts every year really with the formal invitation from Environment and Climate Change Canada, Canadian Wildlife Service, for us to come into their country and do work. And we use that formal invitation to then work with the Department of State here in the U.S. and the Canadian Embassy to essentially get what's called a country overflight clearance, which allows us to operate our aircraft in Canadian airspace. And then after we have that approval, which I'm happy to say that came through pretty much in March this year, we then start to work to get individual diplomatic clearances for each one of our individual pilots and observers that are crossing the border to conduct the survey. It was challenges on many fronts because we still had COVID restrictions pretty much right up to the start of the survey this year, and different protocols in different provinces. But I think things started trending the right way and restrictions were lifted. And at the end of the day, we were able to start this year's survey with 9 air crews and 2 ground crews from the U.S. We combined forces with 3 air crews and 3 ground crews from Canada, and started undertaking this year's survey effort.
Ken, a couple of things to say here. First, we had you on a couple of years ago now, I guess, where we went in depth on the waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey, its coverage, its history, some of the methodology. We're not going to cover all that right now. This is just sort of an update on the exciting news that the survey has been resumed. I'll also say that over the past few months, I found myself being tempted, and occasionally I caved to the temptation to kind of come to the defense of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the surveys, the lack of the surveys over the past couple of years. I think a lot of people, the federal government is an easy target for anything, right? And so people were commenting about how, why couldn't we get outside and do the surveys? And so safest place to be, yada, yada, yada. And so I found myself replying to a couple of people say, hey, just to clarify, and we had talked with you about this earlier, I guess last year, clarifying that very point that it's not like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service can just fly into Canada and start counting ducks anytime they want to. There's a lot of coordination that has to occur, and the restrictions, at least last year, related to some travel restrictions imposed by Canada. And so I just tried to educate people on kind of the international nature of this survey and the the challenges that occur in any given year, and whenever you layer a pandemic on top of it, it's just magnified. So hope you don't mind me coming to your defense there a little bit in some of those exchanges.
Not at all. Very much appreciated. Yeah, when we canceled this survey in 2020, that was right at the start of the pandemic. We knew very little bit about the virus. A lot of states and provinces were under lockdown, and it just made it logistically impossible to pull off. And then, as you mentioned, last year, we still had pretty tight border restrictions, closures there with Canada, which prevented us from entering Canada with our aircraft that year. I know CWS was also under some restrictions with being able to travel and get out and doing field work. So that formal invitation never came last year. But we were able to fly portions of the U.S. survey last year, specifically Alaska and some of the Prairie Strait and North Dakota. But happy to resume this year.
Yeah, for sure. Are there any portions of the survey that have changed since the last time it was fully implemented? We spoke with a number of your Fish and Wildlife Service colleagues over the past couple of years about the survey and always looking forward to, or always trying to find better, more efficient ways of conducting the survey. Has anything major changed since the last time it was fully implemented?
So this year's survey is essentially being flown as planned or as designed. I know we always end up with some minor changes, tweaks, or adjustments that we need to make due to logistics such as weather, maybe breeding phenology of birds, aircraft maintenance, and other type issues. So it's always a bit of a balance between adhering to a perfect survey design with kind of real-life survey logistics. But nothing has changed since 2009, and given we haven't flown in the last 2 years, we all felt it was pretty important to keep that as consistent as possible, just so we have that baseline comparison. But you're absolutely right, Mike. I will say that we are in the midst of a May survey review that we're doing in conjunction with the Canadian Wildlife Service, and we try to review a lot of our major monitoring programs on a periodic basis. Are we still doing the right things? Are we still doing things right? Are there better ways to do things? So we've been undertaking this review with Canadian Wildlife Service for the last couple of years, kind of looking at the objectives of the May survey. Is the sampling frame correct? Or maybe another way to say that is the area that we're surveying correct or still appropriate? Is the timing of the survey correct? Are there better methods? Are there better ways to design this survey? Better ways to collect data? Updated ways to do estimation? So these are all things that we're looking at, but no changes here for 2022.
As I mentioned a few minutes ago, we spoke with Fred Rutger from the field, which that was pretty cool to be able to speak with Fred, record a little episode. He was at northern Alberta, and that was just really cool to hear about what he had seen at that time, or at least that thus far along their survey. He told us at that time it was a bit of a late spring, and I asked if he had an idea of the timeline for completing it, and he suspected it might be mid-June for some of those northern portions. Do you have any type of update on how the progress of the survey is going and when the likely completion date might be?
Yeah, so that's great that you're able to talk to Fred. As you mentioned, he's one of our long-term, lifetime, almost pilot biologists, and it's great to have him still involved in that effort. But as he mentioned, he's correct. We did kind of see a little bit of a late spring this year. We saw some late snow and in April and late season rain in April and May, which did delay the start of the survey a little bit. But for the most part, the survey did start on time and kind of in accordance with the breeding phenology of many of these birds. A lot of our crews will arrive up on the breeding grounds or their crew areas ahead of time, and we'll get out there and do reconnaissance flights just to be sure we are timing the start of the survey with the breeding phenology of the birds. We want to be sure that we're still not seeing massive groups of birds that are grouped up, still migrating, being sure that ice is off some of the major areas, but really like to see birds that are paired and on territories, and we kind of let that guide the start of the survey. So we did see some minor delays this year, but for the most part, everything was pretty consistent with the past.
That's good to hear. So the surveys are still ongoing as of today. Is that kind of what I'm reading, or do you know what the status is in the field?
Yeah, so the surveys are still ongoing. We typically start every year down in the south, in South Dakota, usually around May 1st. That's our typical target start week, and we might adjust that a little bit either way depending on the bird phenology. And then some of our far northern crews typically don't get started until later in May, and we do anticipate those crews finishing up in the far north, Northwest Territories and Alaska, usually mid to late June. That's kind of the norm. Everything's on track for this year. So I know a lot of our prairie and parkland crews have completed their portions of the survey, as well as Maine and some of the Canadian maritime provinces. So they have wrapped things up. And I think right now at this point on June 8th, we are just waiting for those northern crews to finish. And I think Fred was correct that we're probably looking at a mid to late June completion date for those crew areas.
That's great to hear. One of the timestamps that I kind of used in my conversation with Fred was this weekend. The Louisiana State Convention, Ducks Unlimited State Convention, is being held this week, and of course, Fred lives in Lafayette, Louisiana, and I was hoping to see him there, but he told me, he said, "Yeah, I don't think I'm going to be able to make it for that. I think we're still going to be counting ducks at that point." It sounds like he probably is there. So, but that's good. It's great to hear that the survey is still ongoing there. Have you received any input or feedback from the field on what the observers are seeing with regard to duck numbers, habitat conditions? We've obviously heard from some of our people and a few other folks, but just wanted to see if you had any kind of independent observations or reports.
Yeah, so we do get reports back, and I'm always somewhat reluctant to say too much ahead of time without having the complete picture of how things are looking. But as I mentioned earlier, we were fortunate to get some late snow there in April through portions of the Dakotas, as well as some rain there in late April and May, which did improve habitat conditions from what we saw earlier. So that's good. But as far as reports from duck numbers and habitat conditions, they seem to be pretty variable, which, again, isn't all that unexpected. But if people do kind of want that early snapshot of how things are looking, I would love to direct people to the Fish and Wildlife Service website. Our pilot biologists do complete pilot blogs each year, where you kind of get a firsthand account of what they're seeing and when they started. And if you do go to www.fws, as in Fish and Wildlife Service.gov, and do a search for waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey field reports, you can find those crew area reports, again, which will give you that first glimpse, snapshot of what our pilots and observers are seeing.
Ken, I will tell you that I've had several people ask about those this year. So that tells me that in the past, people valued those. They read those. I don't know how much traffic you get on those websites reading those blogs, but at least people here in our organization and a lot of our members have been asking about them. They're wanting that information as soon as they can get it. So I appreciate you sharing that, and we'll see if we can't provide that link in the show notes for this episode as well. And here, as we start to wrap up, Ken, we don't want to take too much of your time. I do want to get to the other, the culmination of all this work is the report that comes out later this year. What's the general time frame for when we can expect to see all of this data summarized and presented in that report? When's that going to be coming out?
So our target date every year to have the waterfowl status report complete is typically mid-August. So that, kind of the culmination of all the data analysis from the May surveys, as well as information on a lot of the goose populations throughout North America. So we try to have that done and available for public inspection, usually by the middle part of August. And really our target there is to have all this information available ahead of the summer flyway meetings. So this information can then be used to inform the regulations process. Specifically for this year's survey will be used to inform the 2023-24 hunting seasons.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. That was one of the other questions that I was going to ask you about, and have you remind people, because we're still in sort of the early years of this new time frame within which we're setting regulations. It's a year in advance that we're setting these. So yeah, the survey results from this year will inform harvest regulations for next year, the 23-24 hunting seasons. And we try to do as much as we can to communicate that, because there's still some confusion. People are wondering about how the results from this summer and how all that goes. And so we try to remind folks of the new change. And so I appreciate you bringing that up. I also just want to take a moment to offer a thank you to you and all of your staff, as well as Canadian Wildlife Service staff, provincial staff, state agency staff that play a key role in this survey, leading it, conducting it. Y'all are the ones that are out there for 6-8 weeks every summer whenever we're doing the survey, collecting this data that's so useful for the management of this resource and so interesting to the people that care about the resource. So I just want to make sure that before we end this, I thank you for all that. Any other thing that we need to talk about here, Ken, that we might not have covered thus far with regard to the progress of this year's survey?
I think we covered it all, Mike, but I would like to maybe just take a moment too to echo your comments and just kind of thank all that are involved in pulling off this survey every year. It's a huge effort, not only from the Fish and Wildlife Service, but the Canadian Wildlife Service. A lot of the state agencies contribute data and information, sometimes personnel to these efforts. And there's a lot that goes into these things. And I just want to thank everybody involved. So, again, I'm happy to report that we seem to be back on track and really looking forward to this year's numbers. That's
awesome. Thanks so much, Ken. Thanks for your time and joining us here. It's always great to catch up with you.
Great. Good to talk to you, Mike.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Dr. Ken Richkus, Chief of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Division of Migratory Bird Management. We also thank all the women and men in the Fish and Wildlife Service, Canadian Wildlife Service, state, provincial agencies that are key parts of this waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey. We thank them for their time and their commitment to helping manage this resource. As always, we thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for the terrific job that he does with these episodes. And to you, the listener, we thank you for your time and spending with us and for your support of wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.